They tell you the Titanic sank because of ice. That's a lie. Ice was just the trigger. The real cause was a system that decided who mattered and who didn't. This is not the story you learned in school. It's about a man history erased, a life saved once, then quietly sacrificed. No hero's monument, no last words, just obedience and water. This is the story of Joseph Harper, and once you hear it, you'll never look at the Titanic the same way again. Listen carefully, because this story was never meant to be remembered. In the final seconds before the Titanic vanished into black water, two lives crossed paths in silence, bound by a debt no history book ever recorded. One of them designed the ship, the other was erased by it. History tells you Thomas Andrews died a hero, calm, noble, accepting fate as his great machine failed, but history never tells you why his eyes were already tired of the future long before that night, or why 14 years earlier he should have been dead, pulled under cold water in a Belfast Harbor, lungs burning, body sinking, until a child the world refused to see reached for him. This is not a story about coincidence. This is a story about how power remembers some lives and buries others. April 15th, 1912. The North Atlantic is silent again. Ice drifts where screams once lived. Official numbers say 1,517 dead. But numbers lie. Numbers erase names, and names erase truths. Among the dead was a black man listed as crew, a steward, barely noted. No photograph, no monument. His name was Joseph Harper. No one tells you that in 1898 Joseph was 11 years old. No one tells you he jumped into freezing industrial water to save Thomas Andrews, the golden son of Harland and Wolff, nephew to power, architect of empire. No one tells you the company paid £50 to seal the story shut. No one tells you the silence was deliberate, because powerful systems cannot survive moral debt. From the moment Joseph pulled Andrews from the water, the equation was wrong. The hierarchy was inverted. A black child had saved a white aristocrat while grown men stood frozen. That moment threatened the mythology that empire runs on: who is valuable, who is expendable, who is meant to be remembered. So the record was corrected. The truth was filed down. The boy was absorbed into the machinery, promised a future, promised work, promised dignity, eventually. And 14 years later, the ocean collected its balance. What you're about to hear is not just about a shipwreck. It's about how institutions launder guilt, how gratitude becomes control, and how history trains you to mourn the wrong people. You were taught to admire the architect. You were never meant to ask about the boy who saved him. Belfast in 1898 was a factory of obedience disguised as opportunity. Iron ruled the skyline, smoke ruled the lungs, and men learned early that survival meant knowing their place and never stepping outside it. The shipyard didn't just build vessels, it built silence. Harland and Wolff was empire engineering itself into permanence. Every rivet was authority, every blueprint was destiny. And Thomas Andrews walked those yards like a man groomed to inherit the future, educated, respected, protected. He was proof that the system rewarded loyalty to its own. Joseph Harper was proof of the opposite. He was born free, which meant nothing. Freedom without power is just exposure. Belfast tolerated black labor but never black visibility. Joseph learned this young, through eyes that slid past him, through insults muttered low enough to deny, through rules that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. He learned to move quickly, to listen more than speak, to make himself useful before being made invisible. The shipyard fed on boys like him. When the launch capsized that afternoon, no doctrine prepared the men on the dock for what followed. Training teaches protocol, hierarchy teaches hesitation, and hesitation kills. They shouted for ropes, they shouted for authority, they shouted for permission to act. Joseph didn't shout, he moved. That moment, when a child without status chose action while men with rank froze, fractured the moral architecture of the yard. It exposed the lie beneath industrial order, that courage is distributed by class, that heroism wears uniforms, that leadership always looks respectable. Joseph shattered that illusion in seconds. That is why the silence came so fast. Lord Peary didn't order secrecy out of cruelty. He ordered it out of necessity. Institutions do not survive truth shocks. They absorb them, they bury them, they convert them into manageable narratives. An accident, a rescue by shipyard personnel, no names, no boy, no debt, and yet debt lingered. Thomas Andrews carried it quietly, not publicly, not in speeches or plaques, but in the way he argued with accountants, in the way he obsessed over safety margins, in the way he stared too long at cold water. Survivors of near death don't fear dying, they fear unfinished reckoning. Joseph was absorbed into the system the only way systems know how, through controlled reward. A future at sea, a uniform, a role, a place that looked like advancement, but functioned as containment. Time did not free Joseph Harper. It refined him into something useful. The sea gave him distance, but not escape. White Star Line uniforms replaced Belfast rags, yet the hierarchy remained stitched into every deck. Below stairs, above silence. The ocean doesn't erase class, it amplifies it. Steel corridors whisper the same rules no matter the latitude. Joseph learned those rules quickly. Speak only when spoken to, move without being seen, serve comfort to men who never learned your name. Watch women draped in silk complain about the temperature while stokers coughed blood below their feet. Memorize exits that were never meant for you. This was the cost of the promise. Every ship he served on carried echoes of that first plunge into cold water. The shock, the pain, the knowledge that hesitation kills, but only some people are allowed to act. Joseph became precise, controlled, quiet, a man trained by systems to suppress instinct unless ordered otherwise, and yet, somewhere beneath that discipline, something refused to die. Because he remembered the dock full of frozen men. He remembered hands that only moved once authority spoke. He remembered how quickly bravery became inconvenient once it disrupted the narrative. He remembered that Thomas Andrews had looked him in the eyes and said, "I will never forget." But memory inside institutions is selective. Personal guilt is tolerated. Structural guilt is erased. Andrews rose. Joseph sailed. They lived in parallel corridors of the same machine, separated by class, color, and permission. Andrews redesigned ships to be safer, stronger, more humane. He argued for double hulls, higher bulkheads, more lifeboats, and every time he was overruled, something tightened behind his eyes. Because he knew. He had felt the water close over him. He had been saved by someone the system would never credit. And now he watched that same system gamble with lives in the name of luxury and speed. The Titanic was not arrogance. It was inevitability. It was the physical manifestation of institutional confidence. Unsinkable did not mean invincible. It meant unquestionable. It meant no contingency that disrupted first-class comfort. It meant faith in hierarchy over reality. Joseph boarded the Titanic because obedience had trained him to, because gratitude had been weaponized into loyalty, because survival had taught him that you don't refuse the path power lays out for you. You walk it quietly and hope it doesn't end badly. He carried Thomas Andrews' compass in his pocket. By the time Titanic left Southampton, Joseph Harper understood something most men never articulate. Disasters are not accidents. They are decisions stretched across time. He felt it in the ship's confidence, the way officers spoke about her like a living deity, the way caution was treated as weakness, and doubt as disloyalty. Titanic was not built to survive nature, it was built to dominate it, and domination always demands sacrifice. Joseph moved through her corridors like a shadow trained by years of invisibility. Polished brass, thick carpets, laughter that never reached below deck. He watched excess pile up where safety should have been. He watched lifeboats reduced to preserve aesthetics. He watched warnings brushed aside because they disrupted schedules. Men of power hate interruption more than catastrophe. Some nights Joseph dreamed of Belfast water. Other nights he dreamed of silence, the kind that falls when no one wants to be responsible. He would wake with the compass clenched in his fist, needle trembling, pointing north like it always had. Truth doesn't change direction just because men refuse to look. And then there was Thomas Andrews. They saw each other only once aboard Titanic. No witnesses, no ceremony, just a glance in a passageway. Recognition flickered, fast, controlled, buried. Andrews nodded. Joseph nodded back. Two men acknowledging a past the world had erased. That moment carried weight, because Andrews knew the ship's weaknesses. He had argued against them, lost, compromised, signed off anyway. That is the final stage of institutional capture, when conscience is allowed to protest but never to stop progress. On April 14th, the warnings came. Ice ahead, slow down, reroute, delay, authority declined. At 11:40 p.m., the collision tore open more than steel. It exposed every lie the ship was built on. As water breached compartment after compartment, Andrews didn't panic. He calculated. He walked. He measured time like a man already dead. Witnesses would later say he seemed calm, resigned, almost relieved. But calm is not peace. Calm is acceptance when struggle is no longer permitted. Joseph felt the shock differently. He felt it as recognition. The ship was doing what systems always do when confronted with reality, failing downward. Third class locked in, orders conflicting, lifeboats launched half full. Priority given not to survival, but to status. And in that chaos, Joseph understood the cruel symmetry closing around him. 14 years earlier, he had pulled a man from cold water while others hesitated. Now, surrounded by protocol and panic, there would be no child to break the rules for him. Doors closed where obedience lived. Corridors narrowed where survival was never intended. Instructions became contradictions, and contradictions became fatal delays. This is how systems collapse. Not all at once, but unevenly, protecting value, discarding inconvenience. Joseph was ordered to help passengers. He did, calmly, efficiently. He guided strangers toward lifeboats he already knew he would not be allowed to board. He tied life vests onto trembling hands. He translated panic into motion. He became what the system demanded in its final hour, useful until expendable. Witnesses later remembered a black steward who never panicked, who kept moving while others screamed, who disappeared before the end. That's how the record phrases it, disappeared, as if vanishing were a choice. Somewhere above him, Thomas Andrews was doing the same thing in a different uniform, directing, calculating, preparing people for an end he had foreseen for years. Two men moving through the same dying machine, bound by a past no one else knew. Did Andrews see Joseph again? No record says so, but records are curated. What we do know is this. Andrews refused a seat. He refused survival when offered. He chose to stay with the ship. History calls this nobility. But there is another interpretation, one institutions never allow. Guilt seeks symmetry. 14 years earlier, Andrews lived because Joseph broke the rules. Now Andrews followed them, and Joseph paid the balance. This is where the story stops being history and becomes initiation. Because this pattern doesn't belong to 1912, it belongs to now. Institutions still reward obedience over courage, still absorb moral acts without credit, still offer advancement as a leash, still let the system survive while individuals vanish. If you're listening to this, you already feel it. So here is the moment where awareness locks in. Before we go deeper, before the final descent, I want you to do something intentional. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee the ending forming long before the impact. Titanic didn't sink because of ice. Ice was just the permission slip. The real cause was institutional certainty, the belief that systems engineered by elites are immune to consequence. That belief requires sacrifice, quiet sacrifice, unrecorded sacrifice. Joseph Harper was engineered into that role years before the voyage ever began. The promise given to him was never freedom. It was placement, a controlled trajectory that kept him useful, loyal, and invisible. He was allowed to travel the world, but never arrive anywhere that mattered. He wore a uniform, but never authority. He carried a compass, but never direction of his own choosing. This is how power converts gratitude into compliance. Every time Joseph followed an order, Every time he swallowed resentment, every time he chose restraint over resistance, the system functioned exactly as designed. Not cruelly, efficiently. Cruelty implies emotion. Systems don't hate. You don't need hatred when structure does the work for you. And this is the most dangerous truth men are never taught. Most oppression doesn't feel like violence. It feels like opportunity you can't refuse. When the ship began to die, the hierarchy didn't collapse. It clarified. First class evacuated into boats meant to preserve dignity. Second class hesitated, waiting for instruction. Third class was delayed, redirected, managed. Crew served until they were no longer needed. Joseph's training kicked in perfectly. That is not praise. That is tragedy. He knew where the water would go. He knew which decks would flood first. Years at sea teach you to read a ship like a body in shock. And still, he did not run. Because running without permission had never been an option. This is the moment that separates myth from reality. The myth says Joseph died because fate was cruel. The reality is Joseph died because he was obedient in a system that only rewards disobedience when it comes from power. Somewhere in the chaos, Andrews realized it too late. He had designed better ships. He had argued for safety, but he had still signed his name, still deferred, still believed reform inside the system would be enough. It never is, because systems don't change when they're warned. They change when they are exposed. Titanic exposed nothing because the wrong men paid the price. Joseph Harper's body was never recovered. No inquiry lingered on his name. No descendant was interviewed. The sea took him, and history led it. After the water closed over the decks, the story was rewritten before the bodies were cold. Inquiries were convened, testimonies selected, language softened, responsibility diluted into weather, chance, miscalculation. The system investigated itself and found no one truly guilty. That, too, is a pattern. Thomas Andrews became legend, the noble designer, the man who accepted fate with dignity. His death was framed as redemption, proof that the system could produce moral men. And moral men are useful shields. They allow institutions to mourn without changing. Joseph Harper became absence. No headline, no painting, no quoted last words. He was folded into the phrase, crew lost. A human life reduced to logistical loss. That is not neglect. That is function. Because if Joseph's story were told honestly, the myth collapses. It would force a question no empire once asked: who actually carries civilization on their backs, and who gets remembered for it? If the public knew that a black child once saved the Titanic's architect, then died quietly serving the system that erased him, the story would no longer be tragic. It would be indicting, and indictments threaten continuity, so memory was managed. The compass was never mentioned. The promise was never revisited. The debt was declared settled by water and time. This is how power cleans its hands, by letting nature take the blame. But here's the thing about suppressed truths. They don't disappear. They mutate. They surface in patterns, in instincts, in the quiet anger men feel when they sense the game is rigged, but can't yet name how. Joseph Harper represents every man trained to be loyal to systems that would never save him. Every man told that patience is virtue, while others are rewarded for defiance. Every man who did everything right, and still paid the price. This is why the story matters now. Because Titanic is not a relic, it's a blueprint. Corporations still cut corners while preaching safety. Institutions still elevate symbols while sacrificing labor. History still teaches you who to admire and who to forget. And men still confuse obedience with honor. Joseph was honorable, and it killed him. Joseph Harper's life asks a question that never appears in textbooks. What happens to a man who does everything right in a system designed for him to lose? The answer isn't dramatic. That's the cruelty of it. He isn't punished loudly. He isn't condemned publicly. He is simply not saved when saving becomes selective. That's how modern power operates, not with chains, but with filters, not with whips, but with policies, not with hatred, but with indifference refined into procedure. Titanic taught the world about hubris, but it hid the deeper lesson. When collapse comes, systems do not protect the moral. They protect the central. Ask yourself who was central on that ship. Ask yourself who wasn't. Joseph's final moments weren't heroic in the cinematic sense. No swelling music, no last speech, just motion, work. Duty carried out until duty no longer mattered. The water didn't rush him. It rose, patient, certain, like consequences always do. And somewhere in those last minutes, whether consciously or not, Joseph would have understood the truth that changes a man forever. Loyalty is only rewarded when it's optional. Everything before that moment was preparation, not for survival, but for recognition. Recognition that never came. That is why this story lingers, because once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. In workplaces that praise sacrifice but promote silence, in systems that call you essential until you ask for protection, in rules that only bend for those who already sit above them. Joseph Harper was not unlucky, he was predictable, and that is the most dangerous word a system can assign to a human life. So here is the final truth, quiet, uncomfortable, and necessary. The Titanic didn't just sink in the Atlantic, it keeps sailing. Everywhere obedience is mistaken for virtue. The question is no longer what happened to Joseph Harper. The question is whether you recognize the moment when following the rules stops being honorable and starts being fatal. Because by the time the water reaches your ankles, the decisions have already been made. Joseph Harper was never meant to be remembered. That was the final design. Not because his life lacked meaning, but because meaning threatens systems that depend on silence. He did not fail. He was not weak. He did not make the wrong choice. He acted exactly as he was trained to act, loyal, restrained, dutiful, inside a structure that never intended to save him. And that is the hardest truth to accept. The Titanic lives in history as a warning about arrogance and engineering, but its deeper lesson is human. When collapse comes, morality does not override hierarchy, obedience does not outweigh status, and sacrifice, when offered by the invisible, is absorbed without acknowledgement. Joseph saved a life once by breaking the rules. He lost his own by following them. That is the paradox no monument will admit. His story is not a call to rebellion for its own sake, nor a rejection of order. It is a demand for awareness, for the clarity to recognize when loyalty becomes a trap, when patience becomes permission, when doing the right thing serves everyone except you. History moved on. The ocean closed. The system endured. But stories have a different purpose than systems. They return what was taken. So remember this. Survival is not granted to the most faithful, but to the most protected. Honor does not guarantee safety, and silence is never neutral. It always sides with power. Joseph Harper did not disappear. He was erased. And now that you know his name, the erasure fails. That is the ending they never planned for.